The wet earth smelled like iron and endings. I stood over the small rectangle cut into the ground, hands numb in my pockets. People talk about grief like it is a wave, but for me, it was arithmetic. It was a cold equation that never balanced. I repeated the summary of my life to the wind. My parents refused to pay $80,000 to save my son's life, but spent $350,000 on my brother's extravagant wedding. Years later, they appeared, and I shut the door. 2 months ago, the air in their kitchen had been warm, smelling of roasted coffee and old money. I sat across from my father, pushing a spreadsheet across the mahogany surface. The paper shook because my hands were trembling. It was the estimate for the experimental immunotherapy in Zurich. It was Leo's only chance. My father did not look at the paper. He looked at the view of the manicured gardens outside, as if the intrusion of my dying 6-year-old son was a scheduling error he could simply ignore. My mother picked up the delicate china cup and took a slow sip. She told me they had to be realistic about liquidity. She used words like success rates and risk assessment, stripping the humanity from my child until he was just a bad investment. My father finally spoke, keeping his voice devoid of affection. He told me that $80,000 was a significant sum for a procedure that was not guaranteed. They suggested I look into state-funded hospices instead. It was the responsible choice, he claimed. I walked out of their mansion with nothing but the echo of their refusal. I went home to my wife, who was waiting by the phone with hope in her eyes, and I had to break her heart. We sold our car. We applied for loans that lenders denied. It was not enough. The timeline accelerated just like the doctors predicted. Leo stopped playing with his dinosaurs. Then he stopped speaking. Then the machines in the room became the only things breathing for him. Now, the rain fell in sheets, turning the soil at the cemetery into thick, black mud. A small group of friends stood huddled under umbrellas, their faces pale with shared sorrow. My parents arrived 10 minutes late. Their luxury sedan rolled up the gravel path, pristine against the gray sky. They stepped out, dressed in designer mourning clothes that probably cost more than Leo's funeral. Eleanor wiped a dry eye with a silk handkerchief. They stood apart from us, an island of untouched wealth. As the priest spoke the final prayers, I saw my father check his watch. It was a subtle motion. A flick of the wrist revealing the gold Rolex beneath his cuff. He caught my eye and gestured vaguely toward the car, mouthing something about a reservation. He was worried about traffic. The realization hit me harder than the wind. I thought I had reached the bottom of my despair, but the shovel hadn't even hit the dirt before they started digging a new hole in my chest. 2 weeks of silence followed Leo into the ground, but obligation dragged me back to my parents' estate. My wife refused to come, claiming a migraine to hide her rage, so I drove alone. The driveway was lined with freshly manicured boxwoods that smelled sharp and expensive. Inside, the dining room table was set for a celebration I didn't understand. Crystal glasses caught the light of the chandelier, refracting rainbows across the white tablecloth. My brother Julian sat at the head, grinning like he had won a prize. I took my seat at the far end, feeling like a ghost haunting the living. My father poured vintage wine without asking if I wanted any. Before the soup arrived, Julian tapped his glass. He stood up, smoothing his silk tie, and announced that Vanessa had said yes. He flashed a diamond that cost more than my annual salary. My mother clapped her hands together, her face finally lighting up with a joy she never showed for Leo. Eleanor beamed at her golden child, ignoring the empty chair where a grandchild belonged. She declared that this wedding would be the event of the season, a true investment in the family name. She talked about venues in the French countryside and imported orchestras. I gripped my fork until my knuckles turned white. Just months ago, she told me their assets were tied up in complex holdings. Now, she was planning a coronation. The soup tasted like ash in my mouth. I cleared my throat, interrupting her monologue about guest lists. I asked how this was possible given the liquidity issues she mentioned in the kitchen. The room went silent. Julian looked confused, his smile faltering for a second. My father set down his wine glass with a sharp click. He told me not to be rude. He said a wedding was different than a medical gamble. It was about the future. His eyes dared me to say another word. Eleanor patted my father's arm to soothe him, though her gaze remained icy. She turned to Julian and told him the budget was open. There was no limit for family happiness. The phrase hung in the air, suffocating. Open budget. They had the money the whole time. It sat in their accounts while I sold my car and begged strangers for help. It was there while Leo's lungs filled with fluid. They simply chose not to unlock it for us. Julian, oblivious to the tension strangling the room, started talking about renting a castle in the Lawyer Valley. He laughed about how expensive the catering was, making a joke about caviar prices. Every laugh was a jagged knife twisting in my gut. He didn't know about the $80,000. He didn't know his party was being funded by the ghost of his nephew. He just saw an open checkbook and a chance to shine. My parents smiled and nodded. I stood up, the chair scraping loud against the hardwood floor. I couldn't breathe the air in that house anymore. My mother asked where I was going before dessert, her tone scolding a petulant child. I didn't answer. I walked out the front door into the cool night air. Behind me, I heard the pop of a champagne cork. It sounded like a gunshot. It signaled the start of a celebration built entirely on the grave of my son. 6 months later, the debt collector's voice had become the soundtrack of my life. I was working double shifts at a logistics warehouse, lifting crates until my back screamed, just to chip away at the $15,000 we still owed for Leo's hospice care. My hands were calloused and stained gray from cardboard dust. Meanwhile, my phone buzzed incessantly with notifications from the family group chat. They were debating the merits of silk versus velvet napkins. I felt like I was living on a different planet. I tried to decline the invitation to the final design consultation, but Eleanor insisted. She said it was my duty as best man to support Julian's vision. I arrived at the floral studio downtown, still wearing my scuffed work boots because I didn't have time to change. The showroom smelled like jasmine and old money. Julian sat on a plush velvet sofa, sipping sparkling water with a slice of lemon. He looked at my boots with a flicker of distaste, but didn't say anything. The florist was a man with manicured hands and a voice like melted butter. He presented a mood board that looked more like a royal coronation than a wedding. He talked about importing white peonies from Holland and creating a hanging garden above the dance floor. Eleanor nodded along, entranced by the vision of cascading blooms. I stood in the corner, calculating how many hours of overtime I would need to work just to buy a single one of those fragile white stems. Julian leaned forward, inspecting the sample centerpiece with critical eyes. He wanted more height, more drama. He asked if they could line the entire aisle with hydrangeas, packed tight enough to hide the grass completely. The florist scribbled notes, smiling the smile of a man about to make a fortune. I watched my mother's face. She looked serious, focused. the same expression she wore when she told me my son was a bad investment. She was calculating, but this time, the math was in her favor. The florist turned the iPad around to show the preliminary total for the floral arrangements. The number glowed on the screen in crisp, black font. $80,000. The room spun. The air left my lungs in a rush. That was the exact number. That was the price of the treatment in Zurich. That was the cost of Leo's life. I stared at the screen, waiting for someone to laugh, to say it was a mistake. But nobody laughed. They just studied the pixels. I felt bile rise in my throat, hot and acidic. My hands clenched into fists at my sides, nails digging into the rough skin of my palms. I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip the table and shatter the crystal vases. But I stayed frozen. I had promised my wife I would get through, without causing a scene. I had to survive this day so I could go back to the warehouse and pay for the son they let die. Julian frowned at the screen, tilting his head to the side. He tapped his chin thoughtfully. He told the florist that $80,000 felt a little light for the impact he wanted. He worried it might look cheap compared to the castle venue. Eleanor agreed immediately. She told them to round it up to $100,000 to ensure the volume was sufficient. They weren't just buying flowers. They were proving that a few hours of fragrance were worth more than my son. The wedding venue was a limestone castle that loomed over the valley like a gaiac, a medieval judgment. I parked my rusted sedan between two gleaming Bentleys, the contrast sharp enough to draw sneers from the valet staff. Inside, the air smelled of imported lilies and expensive perfume, a cloying scent that coated the back of my throat. Waiters circulated with trays of whores, d'oeuvres that looked like intricate jewelry. As I adjusted my rented tuxedo, I overheard a cousin whispering to an aunt near the ice sculpture. She marveled at the price tag of the event. $350,000. The number floated through the room, heavy and absolute, settling on my shoulders like a lead cloak. I stood at the altar next to Julian, watching him sweat through his custom Italian suit. He looked golden and terrified. The perfect protagonist of a fairy tale I was no longer writing. The guests sat in rows of white chairs, a sea of designer hats and polite smiles facing the front. When the bride walked down the aisle, the $100,000 flowers trembled in the breeze. I didn't see the bride. I saw the empty space where a ring bearer should have been standing. Leo would have been 7 today. He would have loved the castle. The grief wasn't a wave anymore, it was just the weather. The reception dinner was held in a glass atrium under the stars, sealed off from the reality of the world outside. My father stood up to give the welcome toast, tapping a silver spoon against crystal. He spoke about legacy and the future of the family line. He called Julian the shining star who would carry our name forward into greatness. He spoke for 10 minutes about success and prudence and family values. Not once did he mention the grandson, who died 6 months ago. It was a surgical excision of history. To them, Leo was a glitch in the programming, a sad footnote they had already deleted. Then the microphone was handed to me for the best man's toast. The heavy metal felt cold and alien in my hand. The room went quiet, expecting the sullen brother to ruin the mood with a scene. I looked at my parents, sitting at the head table, like monarchs on their thrones. I looked for the anger that had fueled me for months, the fire that kept me warm in the warehouse. It was gone. In its place was a vast, frozen lake. I realized I didn't hate them anymore, because hating them required energy I could not afford. I raised my glass. To the things we choose to value, I said, my voice flat. I sat down and watched the room applaud my performance, oblivious to the subtext. The steak on my plate was rare, red juice bleeding onto the white china. I couldn't eat it. I watched Julian laugh at something his new wife whispered, his face unlined by worry or loss. This was their world, a hermetically sealed bubble, where money solved every problem, except the ones they chose to ignore. I placed my napkin on the table, folding it neatly over the untouched food. It was a small gesture, but to me, it felt like signing a treaty. I was not just leaving a party. I was seceding from their union. I made my way toward the exit, while the band started a slow jazz standard. I almost made it to the heavy oak doors before Eleanor intercepted me. She grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so delicate. Her eyes scanned my face, looking for gratitude or admiration for the spectacle she had purchased. Instead, she frowned, smoothing my lapel with an aggressive pat. "You look dreadful in the photos, Henry," she hissed, her voice low enough to avoid a scene. "Fix your face before the cake cutting. You're bringing down the aesthetic." It was the final stone on the scale. I gently removed her hand from my arm, without saying a word. There was nothing left to say that would penetrate the armor of her narcissism. I walked out into the cool night, the bass of the music fading with every step across the gravel. The valet brought my car around, and for the first time, I didn't feel shame about the rust or the noise it made. I got in and drove away from the castle, leaving the lights and the lies in the rearview mirror. I didn't look back. For the first time in a year, the air in my lungs felt like my own. 5 years is a long time to hold your breath, but I finally exhaled. The crushing weight of the hospice debt was gone, paid off dollar by dollar with sweat equity. My wife and I bought a small bungalow on the edge of town, a place with creaky floorboards, and a mortgage we could actually afford. We didn't have imported peonies or limestone walls. We had a vegetable garden and a heater that rattled. It was imperfect, but it was ours. We adopted a dog named Buster, a 3-leg mix who had survived his own traumas. Watching him sleep by the fireplace became my nightly meditation. The silence in our home wasn't heavy like the silence in my parents' mansion. It was peaceful. It was the sound of a life rebuilt from scrap. We stopped checking the mailbox for final notices and started planning trips to the lake. We were healing, slowly, filling the hole Leo left behind with small, deliberate acts of living. Then came the evening the world turned upside down. I was chopping carrots for a stew when the local news bulletin flashed red. A reporter stood in front of my father's corporate headquarters, speaking rapidly about federal indictments. The headline scrolled across the bottom of the screen in white letters. "Massive embezzlement scheme uncovered." I set the knife down, wiping my hands on a dish towel. The carrots lay forgotten on the cutting board. It felt like watching a skyscraper implode in slow motion. The details emerged over the next few weeks, like sewage from a cracked pipe. It wasn't just bad management, it was fraud. The liquidity issues Eleanor had cited years ago were real, but they covered them with illegal schemes to fund their lifestyle. The wedding, the cars, the estate. It was all bought with stolen money. They hadn't refused to save Leo because they were prudent. They refused because their fortune was a house of cards. They were desperate to keep standing. Gravity came for them with a vengeance. Federal agents froze their assets before the ink was dry on the warrants. The country club revoked their membership to avoid the stain of association. Their fair weather friends, the ones who drank their champagne and ate their caviar, vanished into the mist. I watched footage of my father being led into a squad car, shielding his face with a legal pad. He looked small. He looked like a man who realized his legacy was a prison sentence. Julian was the first to break under the pressure. The golden child had never learned how to survive a storm without an umbrella held by someone else. Rumors swirl that his wife left him the moment the credit cards stopped working, taking the jewelry and love with her. He fled to stay with some friends, leaving our parents to face the wolves alone. The family unit, once held together by the glue of wealth, disintegrated the moment the money dried up. My wife walked into the living room, drying her hair with a towel. She saw the news report and paused, her eyes widening as she recognized the faces on the screen. She asked if we should call them, if we should offer help. I looked at the image of my mother weeping outside the courthouse, clutching a designer bag that was now evidence. I picked up the remote. "No," I said quietly. I changed the channel to a cooking show. Winter arrived with a vengeance that year, burying the streets in drifts of dirty white. The wind howled against the siding of our bungalow, shaking the window panes. I was adding a log to the fire when the knocking started. It was faint at first, easily mistaken for a loose shutter. Then it grew frantic, a desperate rhythm against the wood. Buster lifted his head, a low growl rumbling in his throat. I moved to the door, checking the peephole, expecting a delivery driver lost in the blizzard. Instead of a courier, I saw two ghosts huddled on my porch. My father wore a coat that was once cashmere, but now hung heavy with melted sleet. Eleanor stood behind him, shivering so violently her teeth chattered audibly. They looked smaller than I remembered, diminished by the cold. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open, but I didn't step back. I filled the frame, a barrier between the warmth of my home and the ruin of their lives. They stared with wet, pleading eyes. My father spoke first, his voice cracking like dry ice. He asked if they could come in for a moment. I hesitated, then stepped aside just enough to let them into the tiled entryway. I did not invite them into the living room. They stood on the mat, dripping icy water onto the slate floor. Eleanor hugged herself, her knuckles white, looking past me toward the glow of the hearth. I crossed my arms against my chest. "What are you doing here?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Eleanor started to cry, a sound that used to command attention, but now just sounded pathetic. She told me the bank took the house this morning. They had nowhere to go. I asked where Julian was. My father looked at his shoes. He admitted that Julian had left 2 days ago to stay with some friends in Connecticut. He refused to take them. The golden child had polished his own parachute and left them to crash. The bitterness in the room was sharper than the cold draft. They weren't just here for warmth. They were here for a bailout. My father straightened his posture, trying to summon a shred of his old authority. He explained they found a rental on the south side, a place they would have sneered at years ago. They needed $5,000 for the deposit and rent. They couldn't access their frozen accounts. He called it a temporary bridge loan. He promised they would pay me back the moment the lawyers cleared up the misunderstanding with the feds. Then came the second ask, the one that tested the structural integrity of my patience. Eleanor added that the apartment wouldn't be ready for 2 weeks. She looked around my hallway, eyes lingering on the family photos. She suggested they could stay in our guest room until the lease started. It would be just a short visit, she said. Family helping family. She smiled, a fragile expression meant to evoke sympathy. She didn't seem to realize that family was a currency they had devalued to 0 years ago. Eleanor took a step forward, reaching out as if to touch my arm. She complimented the house, calling it quaint and cozy. This was the woman who once called my neighborhood a slum. She said, she always knew I was the resilient one, the strong one. She tried to rewrite history in real time, painting me as the dependable rock they had always cherished. It was a clumsy manipulation. She was trying to pick a lock she had melted down for scrap metal. I looked at them and saw the reversal of every dynamic we had ever shared. 5 years ago, I stood in their kitchen begging for a life. Now they stood in my hallway begging for a lifestyle. They were wet, broke, and alone. I had the fire, the home, and the checkbook. The power sat heavy in my hands, but it didn't feel like a weapon. It felt like a burden. I realized they didn't see me as a son. They saw me as an ATM. My wife appeared at the top of the stairs, holding the banister. She didn't come down. She just watched, her face unreadable but her presence a reminder of what I had to protect. I looked back at my parents. The puddle of melted snow around their feet was spreading, threatening to touch the hardwood. I told them to stop. I told them that flattery wouldn't work, and that the bank was closed. My father's face fell, the mask of dignity slipping to reveal raw, naked panic. Eleanor gasped, looking at me like I had slapped her. She asked how I could be so cruel in such weather. She pointed to the storm raging outside the frosted glass. I didn't blink. I told them that the weather was unfortunate, but it wasn't my fault. I stepped back, increasing the distance between us. They stood on the mat, dripping melting snow onto the floor, waiting for the sun they broke to fix the world they destroyed. But the sun they broke was gone. My father took a step forward, invading the dry space of the hallway. He raised a shaking hand, not to strike, but to beseech. He invoked the sacred bonds of lineage, his voice trembling with a mix of cold and entitlement. He said they were my flesh and blood. He claimed a son had a moral obligation to prevent his creators from freezing. It was a rehearsed speech, likely practiced in the car on the way over. He spoke of duty, as if he hadn't sold mine for a centerpiece. I leaned against the wall, crossing my arms over my chest. I didn't yell. Yelling implies passion, and I had none left for them. I simply asked if they remembered the number 80,000. They blinked, confused by the non sequitur. I reminded them. That was the price tag on Leo's life. Then I asked if they recalled the number 350,000. My father looked away, studying the grout lines on the floor. He knew the ledger I was opening. He knew the balance was due. I didn't let the silence settle. I pressed harder, my voice soft, but distinct over the wind howling outside. I asked if they remembered the floral budget specifically. $100,000 for white peonies that died within 24 hours. Eleanor flinched as if I had thrown a vase at her. I told them I worked overtime for 3 years to pay off a hospice bill that cost less than their appetizers. I wasn't debating philosophy. I was auditing their cruelty. The math was simple and damning. Eleanor wiped her eyes with a wet glove, smearing mascara across her cheek. She argued that the wedding was a different time, a different pot of money. She claimed they couldn't have known the outcome for Leo. It was the prudent choice, she whispered. I nodded slowly, acknowledging her warped logic. I agreed with her. It was different. The wedding was a party. Leo was a human being. A 6-year-old boy who trusted his grandparents to help him breathe. Her justification died in the air between us. My father tried to interrupt, mentioning the deposit again. He reached for his wallet, perhaps to show me empty slots, But I stopped him with a raised hand. I told him clearly that there would be no check. There would be no transfer. There would be no guest room. My home was a sanctuary built on the ashes of the life they refused to save. I would not let the people who burned it down sleep in my bed. The rejection hung heavy and final in the hallway. I walked to the small table by the door, where we kept the mail. I pulled a notepad from the drawer and a cheap ballpoint pen. I wrote down 3 addresses in block letters. I tore the page off with a sharp rip. I held it out to my father. He looked at the paper, confused. I explained that these were the state-run shelters in the city. The same ones they used to mock as warehouses for the lazy. Now, those shelters were their only option. Eleanor peered at the list over his shoulder and let out a strangled gasp. She looked at me with genuine horror, as if I had handed her a death sentence. She said she couldn't sleep in a gymnasium with strangers. She said they were people of standing. I corrected her. Slept. They were homeless embezzlers on the run from consequences. Standing cost money, and they had spent theirs on a castle in the valley. The entitlement was a ghost limb. They still felt it, but it was gone. I turned toward the kitchen, and for a second, hope flared in their eyes. They thought I was going to get the checkbook. I returned a moment later with a brown paper bag. Inside were 2 ham sandwiches and 2 bottles of water. I handed the bag to Eleanor. I told them this was for the road. I wouldn't let them starve because I was not them. But I would not make them comfortable. The distinction was subtle, but as the jagged edge of my mercy. My father didn't take the paper with the addresses, so I tucked it into his wet pocket. He grabbed my wrist, his fingers cold and desperate. He asked what he was supposed to tell people. He asked how he could look his friends in the eye. I gently peeled his fingers off my skin one by one. I told him he didn't have friends anymore. He only had the truth. I opened the door, letting the blizzard swirl back into the warm silence of the house. They hesitated on the threshold, looking back at the fire one last time. Then, with no other choice, they stepped out into the whiteout. Eleanor gripped the sandwich bag like it was a clutch of diamonds. My father hunched his shoulders against the wind, looking instantly older. I watched the realization settle in their eyes before they turned away. The bank of forgiveness had closed 5 years ago, and they were the ones who lost the key. I watched them fade into the gray until they were gone. I pushed the heavy oak door until the latch clicked into place. The sound was mechanical and final, like a judge banging a gavel in an empty courtroom. I threw the deadbolt, sliding the brass bar home with a satisfying thud. Through the frosted glass, I watched 2 dark shapes hesitate on the walkway before the white squall swallowed them whole. The cold draft that had sneaked into the entryway began to dissipate, replaced by the steady hum of the furnace. The house felt instantly lighter, as if the foundation had settled. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood, listening to my breathing. For 5 years, I had rehearsed this moment in nightmares, fearing that seeing them destitute would break me. I expected a surge of pity or a crushing wave of guilt for turning away my own blood. Instead, my pulse remained steady. My hands, which had trembled when I signed the hospice papers years ago, were perfectly still. I looked down at the dirty puddle on the slate tiles. I grabbed a thick rag and wiped the slate clean. Soft footsteps creaked on the stairs behind me. I turned to see my wife standing in the shadows of the landing, her hand gripping the banister. She wore her old flannel robe, the one she bought at a thrift store when we were drowning in debt. Her eyes searched my face, looking for the cracks that usually appeared after contact with my family. She asked softly if they were gone. Her voice was cautious, bracing for the fallout, ready to pick up the pieces. I simply nodded. She walked down the remaining steps and took my hand. Her fingers were warm, a stark contrast to the icy desperation I had just touched. She asked if I was okay, her thumb tracing the line of my knuckles. I took a moment to inventory my chest. There was no anger. There was no shame. There was just the quiet realization that I had protected our sanctuary from the arsonists who burned down our past. I told her that I was fine. For the first time, I wasn't lying. We walked into the living room, where the fire was still popping in the grate. Buster thumped his tail against the rug, sensing the shift in pressure. I looked at the mantel above the fireplace. A framed photo of Leo sat there, taken the summer before he got sick. He was laughing, his face smeared with chocolate ice cream. For years, that image felt like an accusation, a reminder of the check I couldn't write. Tonight, it looked like a memory of a boy who was loved fiercely. I picked up the frame, dusting a speck of ash from the glass. I realized that I hadn't failed him, because I lacked their money. I had honored him by rejecting their values. I placed the photo back in the center, right where it belonged. My wife rested her head on my shoulder, and we watched the flames dance, consuming the wood. The storm raged outside, burying the past in white, but inside, the fire was warm, and the debts were finally paid in full.